morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. And thank you all for your ongoing support. As a small nonprofit, we depend on your viewership and contributions, and we look forward to bringing you a strong lineup of programs throughout the year. Please consider becoming a member. You can check out all the member benefits on our website, and stay tuned at the end and I'll give you a brief update of some terrific upcoming programs that we've just recently booked. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, with our politics professor, Dan Schnur. Dan, it's great to have you back again today to provide clarity on this crazy breaking news.
Well, no shortage of breaking news to discuss, Kim. And thanks as always for having me. And thanks as always to all of you for joining us for these weekly conversations. As usually seems to be the case, we do have quite a bit to cover today, Kim. I had toyed with the idea of going with 30 topics instead of 3, but Jessica and Claire's cooler heads prevailed, so we decided to narrow it down.
Well, let me share that narrowed down 3 items. But again, we'll probably overlap for next week because there's so many questions and we want so much of your time. So the 3 questions Dan has today are: number 1, the world talks about climate change, but then what? Number 2, Biden's border immigration struggles get worse. And 3rd, Dan's pet peeve, selective outrage from both parties. I can't wait. Let me turn this over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim, and thanks for indulging me with the pet peeve, although we'll get to that a little bit later today. And then, of course, as those of you who've been here before know, at the bottom of the hour, we'll shift over from my diatribe to my favorite part of the program, when Jessica joins the discussion and all of your questions, and we address as many of your questions as possible. But let's get started, and let's start out by talking about climate change. Because while technically President Biden will be commemorating the milestone of his 100th day in office later this week, he'll be delivering an address to a joint session of Congress tomorrow, and the day after that is officially his 100th day in office. But Biden's real coming out on the world stage, at least, took place last week when he hosted a 2-day global summit on the critically important topic of climate change, in which 40 of the world's top leaders took part. And the fact that this discussion, that this gathering took place online rather than in person, may have eliminated some of the awkwardness that would normally accompany a gathering of such a breadth of international leaders. But on balance, at least from a substantive standpoint, doing it online as opposed to in person really didn't seem to take that much away from it. So I'm going to get into the details of my thoughts about the summit in just a moment. But before I do, I'm going to ask Claire to put up the first question for all of you to consider. And let's start out this discussion on the summit by asking you whether you thought it was a success. And we've offered 3 options here. First, yes, it was a success, and the gathering will have a substantive impact on fighting climate change on a global scale. Second, yes, it was a success, but primarily in the area of messaging and bringing public and world attention to the issue, as opposed to substantive gains. Then third, no, it won't make much of a difference in the long run. So let's see what our group thinks, Claire. And wow, look at that. Very interesting. 72%, almost 3/4 of you believe it will have an impact, but primarily on a messaging front, as opposed to in terms of substantive progress. Only 20% of you believe a substantive impact will be made, and only 9% said no difference at all. So my guess is that while Biden himself probably would have liked it if 100% of you had said it would have a substantive change, I can't imagine that the president's advisors would be all that unhappy with a set of poll results like those. So let's dig in a little bit, because after 2 days of speeches and promises and predictions, it's impossible to guess how much will change in the ongoing global effort to address the challenge of global warming. But Biden's main goal was achieved, which is why I think he'd be happy with your results. He sent a message to the rest of the world, but what's important about the message he sent is not only did he send a message about climate change, the issue itself, but Biden's main goal, Biden's primary objective with this conference, with this summit, was to send a message to the rest of the world that America is ready to reclaim its global leadership role on a number of issues, of which climate change is only one. And after 4 years of Donald Trump's more unilateralist approach to foreign relations, Biden used the summit to signal that the US would once again engage much more forcefully on the world stage, the way it has in its traditional role for many, many years. Now, not everybody was happy to welcome the US back, most notably China and Russia, both of whom achieved very significant geopolitical gains during Trump's presidency as the US retreated from the world stage and China and Russia both became much more emboldened. China's president, Xi Jinping, was noticeably restrained throughout the summit, and he didn't offer any new commitments on behalf of his country. Vladimir Putin, Putin mainly looked bored, but both Xi and Putin went out of their way to diminish the role that the US and Biden were playing on the climate change challenge. And both went out of their way, their advisors went out of their way to point out that America could no longer be counted on to follow through on Biden's commitments. Several other countries, while they weren't openly critical of the US, didn't make new commitments toward fossil fuel reduction either. Countries like India, Australia, Indonesia, and Mexico were there, but were notably silent in terms of commitments for moving forward. But Biden no doubt still accomplished his chief objective. He played host to the world on an issue of utmost importance, and he planted the American flag back at the center of the conversation. So that's a very good thing for him to both an international and a domestic audience. But, there's always a but, we've talked over the course of this year and I think for much of last year too, about growing tensions between the United States and China on many other fronts. And climate change is no exception, because the two countries are going to be jockeying for leadership on climate change policy for years to come. And that became increasingly obvious during the summit last week. So Biden led with his new promise to reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by more than 50%, by more than half, by 2030, which it's worth noting is only 8.5 years away. And that set a very ambitious example for other countries to follow. And then on day 2 of the summit, he produced Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg to talk about private sector innovation, about job creation, and international investment, which is a message of particular import to developing countries about the economic opportunities that might be available to them. Now, China can't match him on either of those fronts, but they have become a world leader, the world leader in recent years, in manufacturing the technology that's necessary for alternative energies like solar and wind power and biofuels. And China has almost cornered the world market on the types of minerals and raw materials that's going to be needed to produce those materials. So the US has a lot of catching up to do. Now, the stakes for both countries go way beyond greenhouse gas policy. China needs to convince the world, and even more importantly, convince its own citizens, that the US is in decline and that this century will belong to China. Biden, as I said earlier, needs to deliver the exact opposite message, both at home and abroad, that the US can and will still play a vital role in leading the world forward on a seminal issue, a seminal challenge like this one. As you know, as I mentioned earlier, we spent a lot of time talking about the growing competition between the US and China. But along with human rights, with economic growth, with trade, with security issues, we need to add climate change to that list of tensions too. Which leads me to my next question for all of you, if we can, Claire. In 5 years, which country, US or China, will be the world leader on climate change policy? Option 1, the US, option 2, China, option 3, both to some degree, and option 4, neither, that another country or countries will emerge to play that leadership role. That is a fascinating set of answers. Only 2% of our group thinks that China will be the world leader on climate change policy going forward. 79% say the US, either alone or with China, will play that role. 47% say the US, 32%, roughly a third say both. And 19%, about 1 out of 5, say that neither country will. So we'll have to come back in this question in the future, and find out a little bit more about what all of you think. With that 19% of you, who you think will step up. So before we move on to our next subject, though, we should spend a couple of minutes talking about what Biden is actually proposing, and for the political challenges that he'll face here at home to build support for such an aggressive agenda. So here's some numbers for you. To cut the United States global warming emissions at least 50% by the year 2030, 8.5 years from now, half of the country's electricity is going to have to come from renewable sources like wind or solar or hydropower. Right now, we get about 20%, about 1/5 of our electricity from those sources. We're going to have to ramp up in 8.5 years all the way up to getting half of our energy from alternative sources. Also, 2/3 of new cars and SUVs are going to have to be battery powered rather than using gasoline by 2030. Today, roughly 2% of private vehicles, both new cars and SUVs, are fueled by electricity rather than gasoline. We're going to have to go from 2% up to 67% or more in a remarkably short period. Nearly all coal-fired power plants will need to be shut down. The number of wind turbines and solar panels are going to have to roughly quadruple to accomplish that change. And on top of all of those policy changes and consumer changes, let's think about the political changes for a moment. Because on top of all that, Biden is going to have to count on Democratic candidates winning the next 2 presidential elections in 2024 and 2028 in order to remain on this path, or to rely alternatively on the shift of the Republicans to nominate a candidate who would continue in this direction. Just by way of historical perspective, the last time one party or the other won 3 presidential elections in a row was more than 40 years ago, when Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were both elected. So can this all be done? Technologically, yes. Politically, well, I guess we'll see. All right, let's go on to topic 2, Biden and the border. So as we come close to this 100 days mark that I mentioned earlier, public opinion polls show that Biden has very strong support in the country. It's a very polarized nation, but particularly for his efforts on the coronavirus, Biden is supported by large majorities of Democrats, but even a significant plurality of Republicans on COVID-related issues. More broadly, we're seeing the kind of polarization that has existed in this country for many years. But on balance, Biden, with support from Democrats and most independents, is doing pretty well in the eyes of the American people. The one glaring exception, though, is the public's disapproval for his approach for dealing with the crisis at the US-Mexico border. So before we go any further, let's get your thoughts on this issue. How would you rate Biden on border issues? Pretty straightforward here. Excellent, good, fair, or poor. And we know there's all sorts of extenuating circumstances, and we'll talk about those going forward. But just on a sheer rating, Claire, let's see what our group has is said about Biden on border matters. Well, this is really instructive because for a group that I think we've established before does tend to lean somewhat leftward, roughly half of you, 49%, rate him as fair. 29%, a little bit less than 1/3, say either excellent or good, and 22%, almost a full quarter, would rate him as poor. So Biden and his allies have made it very clear that they were left with an immigration infrastructure that had been largely dismantled, which has made it very difficult to deal with this large number of new arrivals that we've been seeing since he took office. But others point out that the new administration ignored warnings from career immigration and border officials that Biden's more welcoming language and more welcoming message would lead to a dramatic increase in the number of individuals and families who cross the border, and that no adequate preparations were made, even given those warnings. And then Biden himself caused a pretty major political problem for himself last week when the White House announced that they would not be increasing the limits on the number of refugees that the Trump administration had imposed during Donald Trump's time in office. Now, Biden promised during his campaign and during his first weeks in office that he would restore a much higher limit for refugee admissions. The Trump administration had reduced the level of refugee admissions into this country down to 15,000. And it's worth noting that historically, under both Democratic and Republican presidents, over the last generation or so, the US has generally allowed in roughly 60 or 70,000 refugees from other countries each year, individuals facing not economic difficulties, but political persecution. So Biden had said that he was going to increase that 15,000 number that Trump had imposed, that limit, that he would later this year raise that number up to just over 60,000. And then by next year, raise it to 125,000 refugees a year, which is an unprecedented number in the modern era. So last Friday, the White House announces that they're not going to increase those refugee admissions after all. And Biden, as a result, faced some very significant and very harsh criticism from within his own party. And after several hours of taking friendly fire on this, the White House announced that the refugee cap would be increased, but they didn't say by how much. And they said that they wouldn't announce a number until the middle of May. So all sorts of confusion on the back and forth going on with this very critical issue. Now, in the meantime, the number of immigrants arriving into the country continues to grow. The administration is scrambling to find suitable accommodations for them, especially for children and for families. Biden has assigned the Vice President, Kamala Harris, to work with the governments of Mexico and the relevant Central American countries to see what can be done. But those are long-term projects, not short-term relief. And Republicans have made it very clear that they see this as Biden's most obvious policy weakness. And they've made it very clear that they will hammer him on this issue throughout the midterm elections next year. But in the middle of all this, there actually is some reason for optimism. Because it's been reported that there's a bipartisan group of senators, roughly an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, who've been meeting over the last several weeks to talk about a possible path forward on immigration policy. Now, the full-scale comprehensive reform that Biden proposed back in January has no chance of passage, at least not in the immediate future. But the senators from both sides who come to the table have brought what they consider to be their top policy priority. And so the discussions on the compromise have focused on two things. Number one, on a legalization not for all undocumented immigrants, but particularly for the dreamers, the young people who came here as part of the DACA program when they were children with their parents. So the Democrats have made legalization for dreamers their top priority, and Republicans have made it clear that border enforcement is theirs. So the negotiations going on right now would not be completely acceptable to the bases of either parties. But there is increasing prospects for a compromise that would include a legalization path for dreamers, along with an increased border enforcement process. So what do you think of this? We don't know if this compromise is going to come to fruition or not, but Claire, if we can put up our fourth question, I'd be interested in thinking what our group thinks about this potential compromise. Legalization for dreamers on one hand, more of a border presence on the other. What do you think? Would you support this kind of compromise? Number one, yes, this is an ideal solution. This is exactly what we should be doing. Option two, yes, it's not ideal, but it's a good compromise. At least it's a step forward. Number three, no, I don't like this because it leans too far toward enforcement. Or number four, no, I don't like it because it leans too much for legalization. So let's see what we get. Well, more than 3/4 of you, very interesting, more than 3/4 of you support the compromise because even if it's not ideal, it represents an important step forward. 12% of you, which isn't a small number, believe that this is the right step forward on its own merits. And then smaller percentages of you think that it leans too far in one direction or the other. Well, I'll tell you who agrees with the 77% of you who said that this is a good compromise. George W. Bush agrees with you, and so does Bill Clinton. Former President Bush indicated his support for this type of compromise just last week, as Clinton had previously. And there's actually talk about the two former presidents joining together to advocate jointly on behalf of such a deal. And the odds are still long, but the conversations are making progress. And we'll keep an eye on this for you and give you more updates when we learn more. So topic number three, my pet peeve is what I call selective outrage. And what I explain to my students is that one of the greatest challenges we face in American politics and politics in many other countries as well is the fact that we're much more willing to become outraged at misbehavior from our political opponents, even while we're finding reasons to excuse that exact same or similar behavior from people on our side of the aisle. And so I want to talk about this concept of selective outrage in the context of the verdict of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Last week, we discussed the trial and the potential political and policy paths forward. And we will talk more in the weeks ahead about the prospects for police reform legislation. Because it does, even since last Tuesday, it looks like Representative Karen Bass and Senator Tim Scott are making real progress, particularly on the questions of police liability that we talked about last week. But today, if you don't mind, I'd like to vent a little bit, specifically about two members of Congress who, in my opinion, handled themselves particularly badly during the highly sensitive days surrounding the Chauvin verdict. Now, for the most part, I think you'd agree, the national conversation surrounding the trial stayed remarkably calm and mostly reasoned. But Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, and Maxine Waters, the Democratic representative from here in Los Angeles, in my opinion, managed to distinguish themselves for the insensitivity and crassness of their statements as part of that conversation. Now, Waters went first. She spoke at a rally the weekend before the verdict, in which she called on protesters to, quote, get more confrontational, unquote, if Chauvin were acquitted. And in talking to protesters, Waters also said, quote, if nothing does not happen, then we know that we've got to not only stay on the street, but we've got to fight for justice, unquote. So now Waters defended her comments the next day, and she's since written an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times, arguing that despite the use of words like confrontation and fight, he was not advocating violence. But in my opinion, at a time when emotions were so highly charged and so raw, to go to Minneapolis to speak to a frightened and an angry group of protesters in such highly charged terms was irresponsible. And even the judge presiding over Chauvin's trial said that Waters' remarks could be grounds for an appeal. So then there was Greene, and we've heard a lot from Marjorie Taylor Greene over her campaign last year in her first weeks in Congress, and she held true to form. The day of the verdict, she sent out a tweet in which she referred to Black Lives Matter as, quote, the strongest terrorist threat in our country, unquote. Now, unlike Waters, Marjorie Taylor Greene made no attempt to back down from her slur, and she employed a very common tactic in which Black Lives Matter protesters are conflated with those who protest under the umbrella of the Antifa, which is the term for leftist militants who've engaged in violent behavior. Now, Greene had already been stripped of her committee assignments in Congress as a result of her supportive references to the QAnon conspiracy group and a range of other outrageous comments she's made since taking office. And very ironically, Greene called for Waters' expulsion from the House. So before I go any further in my own rant, I'd like to stop for a minute and pose one last question to you. What do you think should have been done? Should both Waters and Taylor Greene have been censored by Congress? Should neither of them have been disciplined? They have a right to free speech, and just because they're members of Congress doesn't mean that's taken away. Third, do you think that Maxine Waters should be censored, but Taylor Greene should not? Or fourth, do you think that Taylor Greene should be censored, but Waters should not? So what do we have, Claire? Oh, 54% of you believe that both ought to be censored. 19% say that neither of them should be. Only 2% say that Waters should be censored for his remarks, but Taylor Greene shouldn't. And a quarter of you believe that Taylor Greene should be censored, but Waters should not. Now, as you know, I generally tend to leave my own opinions out of these things. I think one of the reasons that we're able to have such a constructive conversation every week is because we talk about these things not as advocates or combatants, but as observers. At least that's the role that I try to play in presenting these issues to you each week. But on this one, I am going to offer my own opinion, and I agree with the majority of you. Because my own opinion is that both representatives deserve a formal censure for their remarks. But, and this is what aggravates me, is the selective outrage I talked about a few minutes ago. Because neither Marjorie Taylor Greene or Maxine Waters will be facing any penalty at all, with the possible exception of public embarrassment, to which both appear to be pretty much immune. Because Congress has become so polarized that not a single member of either party was willing to stand up and speak out against their behavior and their comments. Well, that's not exactly true. Every Republican member of the House voted to censure Waters, and every single Democrat opposed the measure. And these party line results were the mirror image of a vote earlier this year, when every Democrat voted to revoke Taylor Greene's committee assignments for the reasons we talked about earlier, and only a handful of disgusted Republican House members joined them in expressing their disapproval toward Taylor Greene. Both parties, after the vote on Waters last week, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, were very eager to call out the hypocrisy of their opponents. And they accused each other of trying to score cheap political points at the expense of one offender while excusing or minimizing a similar excess from within their own ranks. Both sides are entirely correct, and both sides are entirely hypocritical. And if we are going to expect our Congress to work together on issues of substance and policy, then ultimately we're going to need more than a handful of members who are willing to stand up to such unacceptable behavior in their own ranks, putting at the very least the comity of Congress, let alone the welfare of the country, over their own partisan leanings. So that's my pet peeve. Depending on how you guys respond in your surveys this week. I may offer pet peeves in the future or may not and go back to my usual more neutral role. But either way, it's time for Jessica to join us and to begin to go through all of your questions. So Jessica, where do the questions seem to be coming this week?
Well, let's take a look. So those of you who would like to ask Dan a question, there is a question section on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So you can send in your questions there and we will get to as many of those as we can. The first question coming in, most of the people discussing climate change will be dead before any results are seen. It seems as if leaders are going through the motions now. Why should they care?
Why should they care? I assume that they in this question is why should voters care? And I think the reason voters should care is because, well, for two reasons. One, this is a long-term challenge for us as a planet. And even for those of us who might not be around to see the most cataclysmic impact of climate change. Hopefully, just as we try to provide for the future by funding education, by funding healthcare, by funding public safety, hopefully we have some vested interest, even if we're not going to be here ourselves, in the welfare of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren who will be living in the planet that we left behind. But second, as I think many of you know, this is not a long time off in the future dynamic anymore. We're seeing the impacts of climate change already here in the US and around the world. Increasingly violent weather patterns, drought, floods, hurricanes, all sorts of weather patterns that are creating millions of refugees, and among other things, exacerbating the world's immigration crisis. So one, I think it's something for us to focus on for the long term, because even if we won't be here, we do want to do everything we can to provide a better future for those who follow. But second, it isn't just the future, it's the here and now.
Thank you so much. Sorry, just trying to read through all the questions that are now flooding in. Is there anything the legislature or courts can do to preclude or delay the date of the gubernatorial recall election?
Well, for those of you who are not in California, you may have heard that there's been an effort, I'm sure you've heard that there's been an effort to recall our Governor Gavin Newsom from office. And just yesterday, the California Secretary of State announced that there were a sufficient number of signatures to qualify the recall of Newsom for the ballot. So the questioner is asking, is there a way to keep it from happening? And the answer is probably not. There is currently a 4 to 6 week process that's just beginning today, in which opponents of the recall can try to convince voters who sign the recall petitions to withdraw their signature. And if enough people who signed the petition have either changed their mind or felt like they were asked to sign under false pretenses, then the recall process would stop. But because the supporters of the recall handed in so many more signatures than were required to qualify the measure for the ballot, it looks very, very unlikely that the recall opponents could convince enough people to change their mind. So I don't think that's likely. At that point, there are a few other procedural steps to go through, primarily relating to the cost of the recall election. But barring something very, very unforeseen, it's almost impossible to see a situation in which the recall would not take place. The Lieutenant Governor, Alani Kounalakis, is vested in the state constitution with the responsibility of setting the exact date of the recall. And once those other procedural steps are completed, in all likelihood sometime in July or August, she has the ability to set a recall date for between 60 and 80 days of when the final conclusions are presented to her. That means for the most likely outcome is that the recall would be held sometime this November. But depending on how long each of those procedural steps take over the next few months, it's entirely possible the election could take place as soon as August. The only way to delay the recall from taking place in November would be for the legislature and governor to agree that the recall election ought to be consolidated with the nearest statewide election, which would be the 2022 primary, currently scheduled to take place next June. But that seems like a pretty unlikely outcome also. So while nothing is impossible, particularly in California politics, by far the most probable outcomes at this point is that the recall will proceed and that it will take place sometime this fall.
Thank you. Yeah, we were looking back over your past webinars. I think it was episode 45, where you did kind of a breakdown of Cuomo and DeSantis and Newsom. And so Clara is going to try to pull that clip so we can post it to our social media to see kind of your breakdown of how things might go with this.
That would be great. And it concerns me a little bit that you guys know the webinars by number, but I'm impressed.
We got to track all these things somehow. Our next question, why is the GOP trying to discourage mask wearing and vaccinations?
Oh, this has become a point of cultural division in the country. And I think it began last spring when President Trump voiced his skepticism on an ongoing basis, first for the severity of the pandemic, and then for what he felt was an overreaction on many parts for mask wearing and other social distancing precautionary measures. Now, Trump himself, of course, has had the vaccine, and he has now said a couple of times in public that he does believe his supporters should get it. It was reported just earlier this week that some of former President Trump's advisors are trying to convince him to record a public service announcement urging his supporters to get the vaccine because of the health concerns involved. And their thinking is that because he has made the point in public a couple times, but it might not have gotten the exposure or attention that it needs to, that recording a formal statement from Trump urging his supporters to go ahead and be vaccinated could be of some real help. Because, of course, in order for us to reach the appropriate threshold of herd immunity, we're going to need between 70 and 80% of people to get that vaccine done. And while there are pockets of resistance in some low income and rural and minority communities, the biggest obstacle at this point does come among self-described Trump-supporting Republicans. And so if the former president were to decide that this is the role he wanted to play, my guess is he could have a very pronounced impact on those vaccination rates.
Thank you. Is it reasonable or wise to increase the number of refugees from Central America admitted to the USA when we are likely to have to admit true political refugees from Afghanistan?
Well, the question, of course, is whether these two different sources of refugees should be an either or an and both. So if the Biden administration does adhere to candidate Biden's original commitment to increase the level of refugee admissions up to 125,000, then that may not allow every potential refugee to come into this country, but it's going to make the decisions a lot less difficult. But the questioner does raise a really important point, and this was one that hasn't gotten very much attention at all in the mainstream news media, that given President Biden's decision to remove the last of our troops from Afghanistan by this September, there's an awful lot of Afghanis who put themselves at considerable risk to work with US military and with NATO over the last 20 years. And the concern is that once US and allied troops have left, that these people will be in a very, very dangerous situation at the hands of the Taliban. So there clearly is a moral obligation for the US and other countries that have been involved in Afghanistan since 2001 to take in as many of these refugees as possible, as opposed to any number of women and children who begin to grow up under a different set of societal circumstances than may be the case once the Taliban assumes control again. So I suspect that the US will be part of a multinational effort to admit many of these Afghani refugees, but depending on the ultimate outcome of the debate within the Biden administration of how high to raise the level of refugee admissions, I don't know that it would be enough to preclude an additional number of refugees coming from Latin America. And finally, it's worth noting that while the questioner understandably focused on Afghanistan and Latin America, given the attention that these two regions have received, there are potential refugees from all over the world looking to come to the US, to Europe, to some of the more economically successful and stable Pacific Rim countries. We talked about this a few episodes ago, might have been episode 49 or 50, Jessica, if I'm not mistaken, where we talked about the immense number of individuals and families who are looking to come to the US or to Europe in the years ahead. So while Central America and Afghanistan deserve our consideration, if the number of refugees admitted does go back up to 125,000, there's a whole big world out there, and that's going to be an incredible policy and logistical challenge, not only for this president, but probably for his next 2 or 3 successors.
This next questioner says, Biden and the Democrats have no coherent policy on the Mexican border issue. The administration has stated that no child seeking asylum will be turned back at the border. This is a signal for every teenager in a rotten economic situation to head north. Will Biden make the tough decisions to make clear who we will accept and who we will not?
Look, the pressure is building on Biden to be more clear and more consistent on what his administration's policy is going to be, not only as it relates to the border, but as it relates to the border, to the broader refugee question. Some of the president's statements have turned out simply not to be true. When he said earlier in the year that all families were being returned to Mexico, which has not been the case. Biden is trying to navigate a very difficult political path here, and the Republicans, as I mentioned earlier, see a tremendous opportunity in this for them. On one hand, Biden wants to reverse the Trump-era immigration policies on humanitarian grounds. On the other, there are logistical questions, not only in border communities, but elsewhere in the country, about how well equipped the US government, how well equipped this administration is to handle such a large surge. And as focused and as consistent as Biden has been talking about COVID and talking about economic growth, he hasn't been nearly as clear or as consistent on this issue. And I think circumstances are going to demand it. The flap we saw last Friday over the refugee cap is just the beginning. And if I had to guess, I'd say the Biden administration is going to put a lot of quiet support behind that bipartisan compromise I was talking about earlier, if only so he can claim some achievement on immigration policy in a broader, more challenging issue that, answers are going to be very, very hard to come by.
In a post opinion today, there is acknowledgement that the U.S. Census Bureau indicates that the U.S. population is headed for a period of demographic age stagnation, with negative consequences for economic growth. Thoughts on whether Biden should open up our borders and boost population growth so that he can turn a crisis into a solution for our pressing problem threatening our future?
Well, this has been one of the arguments that immigration advocates have just been beginning to make. And frankly, I'm surprised that it's one they haven't made in the past, which is the US, like many countries in Western Europe and like Japan, is no longer maintaining a sufficiently high birth rate to maintain our overall population levels. A society needs to have a birth rate of just over 2 in order to maintain it at certain levels, and the U.S. is now below 2. And so immigration advocates, as I said, are beginning to make the argument that unless you want to have a graying society in which an increasingly large number of retirees are becoming dependent on an increasingly shrinking workforce, that allowing more immigrants to come in and expand the workforce is a way not just to keep the economy growing, but also a way to ensure that social services are available to seniors in a way that might not be the case otherwise. Because the argument that gets made is if we have more and more retirees and fewer workers, it becomes harder politically to sustain Social Security and Medicare at their current levels. Whereas if you find a way to increase the number of workers, then it becomes a more sustainable proposition. We're seeing the effects of this graying of society in Japan and in many Western European countries. Unless the native-born United States population decides collectively to reverse recent trends, and we begin to see an increase in the birth rate, the only logical way to not just increase but even maintain the workforce is through some type of migration process.
So I mean, this is just my question, but how do environmentalists then kind of round that out? Because on the one hand, they've been pushing for lower people to have smaller families and lower birth rates. And so on the one hand, you're saying that we should do immigration rather than people having their own children here in the United States. And then there's also economic factors like the fact that we have a large homeless population here. How do they balance all of that?
So I should be clear, Jessica, I wasn't advocating that we should increase immigration as a preference to increasing the birth rate. I'm just saying that if the birth rate is going to continue to shrink, and current trends expect that it will, the only way to maintain a population and therefore a workforce is through immigration. There's only two ways to increase the population in any community. One is through birth, the other is through new arrivals. And so if you decide that it's desirable to maintain a certain level of population, then one or both of those is necessary. Yeah. The environmental movement, and it was not one of their proudest chapters, but in the mid to early late 20th century, many environmentalists argued against immigration reform for just the reasons you're talking about, because the population increase would potentially have an adverse environmental impact. And as the immigration debate developed, happily, in my opinion, most well-considered environmental protection leaders adopted their thinking on that. But it's a critically important question, Jessica. And if you assume that you need a certain number of people to maintain a certain level of economic activity, and therefore to maintain a certain level of support for those who can no longer work, then those people have to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And either an increased birth rate or increased immigration are the only two options. There's an argument to be made by some in the environmental community, and I think this is the premise of your question, that lower levels of population can be environmentally desirable. And I understand that argument, but you have to consider the flip side to it also, that a lower population and lesser environmental impact also means a lesser population and lower economic growth too. And those are very, very difficult trade-offs.
Yeah, I just see all of those different parties kind of fighting with each other over trying to find the best policy long-term for everyone. So as I was just kind of curious, like what you were hearing when people were talking about this issue, because you have the immigration advocates, but the other ones that you mentioned. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I would say in the Overton window of population policy, there's not a large enough contingent of those who are willing to sacrifice economic stability in the interest of environmental protection for that argument to maintain a great deal of salience. But whether it's in the name of environmental protection on one side of the aisle or just nativism on the other, either way, public opinion trends show that increasing numbers of Americans do believe that an immigration influx, if properly handled, is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Thank you. Can you share your impressions about the outcome of Republican meetings in Florida over the past weekend? What does it reveal about Republicans' stance in the next 18 months?
So for those of you who have not followed this, the Republican House caucus is gathered in Florida for a strategy conference. And the most notable thing that's come out of that is a real schism between the Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, and Representative Cheney of Wyoming, who's number 3 in the House leadership. Cheney, as I think all of you know, has been very critical of President Trump through the transition and through the inauguration and since. McCarthy has been much more supportive, and he did an interview last week in which he talked about the necessity of he as a party leader maintaining a relationship with Donald Trump in order to keep Trump supporters within party ranks. But as Cheney's become more aggressive in her criticism of the president and talk of President Trump, former President Trump, and talking about how what she sees is not a significant role for him in the party going forward, it's clearly causing tensions within the caucus. And McCarthy, who is known, is almost legendary for being one of the most affable human beings on the planet, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, that's just the way Kevin McCarthy is wired, has begun showing increasing irritation toward Cheney for her continuing distress, her discomfort with Trump's role in the party going forward. To some degree, this will get resolved in the midterms next year, but more likely it doesn't get resolved until the 2024 presidential election, or at least the Republican presidential nomination, when Republicans choose a nominee who is either Donald Trump himself or a strong supporter of his, or alternatively, choose someone from the pre-Trump or post-Trump wing of the party. And speculation is now grown that Representative Cheney is considering a candidacy of her own. So this is a manifestation of the pro-Trump and pre-Trump split that we've talked about many times in the past, but now it's really personified by McCarthy and Cheney, and that's going to make it very challenging for the Republican House caucus to stay unified going forward.
How likely is it that the House of Representatives will have a Republican majority after the 2022 election as a result of census reapportionment of the number of representative seats from Democratic majority states to Republican majority states?
So I think it is more likely than not that Republicans will regain control of the House of Representatives. And that's less because of the census results, and I can talk about those in just a minute, and more because historically speaking, it's almost inevitable that a president's party loses seats during that president's first midterm elections. The one exception to that, is Biden's advisors will hasten to tell you correctly, was in 2002, when a year after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, George W. Bush's Republican Party gained seats rather than lost them. But that's the only time in the modern era that a president's party has gained in Congress rather than lost ground during those first midterms. The questioner is referring to the announcement yesterday from the U.S. Census Bureau of the new congressional allocations. And what we're going to see in 2022 is a continuation of a trend that we've seen over the last couple of decades, where the country's population is gradually shifting from the Northeast and Midwest to the Southeast and the Western United States. And while there's exceptions to this overall trend, the overall trend is seats switching from blue states to red states. Now within states like Texas and Florida that have gained congressional seats as a result of the most recent census, there's some disagreement on whether those seats will automatically become Republican, because a lot of the growth in states like Florida and Texas has been from younger people in minority communities. But on balance, Republicans gained slightly geopolitically with this new allocation. Joe Biden would have gotten 3 fewer electoral votes if this apportionment was in place last year. Donald Trump would have gotten 3 more. So it's a difference, not a seminal one, but it is a continuation of geographic trending in which Americans continue to move from blue America to red.
This questioner says, hasn't there been talk about a crisis of work with increased automation? Doesn't the lower population growth help with this?
So there has been talk about this work crisis, the idea that technological advances will mean less workers, particularly less lower skill workers, required. This is the argument that Andrew Yang made when he ran for president last year and that he's currently making in his run for mayor of New York City, that you need to provide a universal basic income in order to support all these displaced blue collar workers. And I guess my own feeling on this is while the leaps forward in technology will have dramatic change on the workforce, we don't yet know for certain what that change will look like. After the Industrial Revolution, there was widespread prediction that we would need fewer workers because machines would take care of many more of those jobs. And what we found is that while machines took care of a lot of the jobs that had previously been done by manual labor, it created opportunities for many other jobs. And in these early stages of the technological revolution, we're seeing the same thing. So I don't think we know yet that advances in technology will automatically mean fewer jobs required rather than more. What we do know is that regardless of the overall job numbers, that there'll be fewer blue-collar jobs, fewer service industry jobs, and it puts an increased premium on education to prepare young people for the jobs that are going to be created as a result of the technological revolution. If we prepare Generation Z for factory jobs and food service jobs, then the questioner is right. We're going to end up with a real problem. We're going to have to find ways to support those people. That's why it's more important than ever to make sure these young people have job skills to thrive in a technology-based economy, not just in a manufacturing-based one.
I always think when we have that conversation to think about taxing the robots too, so that those social service programs you were mentioning, that those will still be supported, because it seems crucial.
I'm going to need between now and next Tuesday to get my head around the idea of taxing robots. So if maybe we can come back to that.
Sounds good. This question says, is Antifa a real organization or just a pejorative term used by the right to define an organization with which they disagree? Antifa means anti-fascist, which should define all political organizations in the US.
It's the answer is it's something in between. There is no formal Antifa organization, but it's also not just a collection of individual rebels. Let's call it a very loosely organized collection of many individuals and small groups, all of whom have some very, very strong opinions, and some of whom are willing to express those opinions through violent activity. My point earlier toward Marjorie Taylor Greene's comment or her tweet was that the Black Lives Matter movement, while also not being able to be identified by one specific organization, is much less likely to engage in the type of violent behavior that we see from self-proclaimed members of Antifa. So it's not a formal organization. Let's call it, like I said, a loosely structured collection of groups and individuals.
Do you believe that the Trump administration's strenuous efforts to disrupt the census have had any impact upon the reported results?
Well, there's already some question about whether the number of Latinos counted in this census was adequate. It was thought that Arizona might gain a seat in Congress. That was not the case. It was thought that Florida might gain a second seat. It was thought that Texas might gain the third. And none of those things happened. And we won't know for some months, but it appears that there may be some evidence that the number of Hispanic Americans were undercounted. And whether that's a result of the delays of doing the census or other things that were going on between 2017 and 2021 is a conversation that I'm not prepared to give a solid answer to right now. But I'd say the impact of the delays in the census, one, could have harmed the level of Latino participation. The other real challenge, and we'll see this in the months ahead, is whether delays leave enough time for new congressional and legislative districts to be drawn in time for next year's election. Right now, here in California, there's a matter of weeks between the target date for completing the new district lines and the filing deadline for office. And there's already some talk about delaying California's primary next year from June to July or even August or September in order to give potential candidates more time to decide whether they want to run under these new lines or not. So there may be a Latino undercount. We'll learn more about that in the future, but it's pretty clear that the delay is gonna put a real onus on almost every state in the country to either rush to complete their district drawing on time, even if it means losing some important public input, or alternatively delaying primaries in order to allow those legislative and congressional lines to be drawn the way they're supposed to be done after a census.
Wonderful. Well, Dan, thank you so much again. We're at the end of the hour, so I will turn this back over to Kim. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica. You do such a great job with all the questions. And Dan, we can't thank you enough. We're so appreciative of all the time you dedicate to these weekly sessions and the thoroughness of the topics that you're able to cover. I think none of us are having to get extra psychology or psychiatry because we have you weekly to weave your way through all of the issues. So thank you so much. It's just stupendous.
Well, thank you, Kim. And I agree with you. Jessica is absolutely terrific. And even though the audience doesn't see her, Claire is too. You have a great team over there.
We are so blessed. And we so appreciate our wonderful viewers too. Their support, their viewership, those who are joining to become members is really helping keeping us going. So we're so appreciative. If you'd like to make a contribution, there's an easy way to do it. You can just text the name Schnur to the number in the chat on your control panel. Any amount helps because we're not being able to do in-person events right now, which was a key source of our revenues. And with these live streams are for free, we really depend on your contributions. So thank you. We have a terrific lineup of programs. On Thursday, we have Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America with Alec McGillis. Of course, next week, we're back with Dan on Tuesday in Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. On the 5th, the conversation with Robert Refkin, a special Mother's Day tribute to mothers and mentors. We have a really special program on May 6th, Rock Me on the Water. This is a conversation with Atlantic editor Ron Brownstein and former deputy managing editor of the Los Angeles Times, Leo Walensky, who will be talking about Ron's new book. And on the 17th, Creating Opportunity from Crisis, a special program for high school students learning from the global consequences of COVID-19. So please go to our website, register today, become a member, make a donation. Everybody stay safe, and we hope to see you Thursday. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.